One of the first opportunities I want to talk about is Melbourne. A lot of people actually wanted to a bit pessimistic about Melbourne right now. Melbourne is actually undervalued compared to Sydney. We talked about that, but even compared to some of the other capital cities as well. But what people may not have realized is that Melbourne has recently overtaken Sydney as the biggest city in Australia. So the population of Melbourne have just exceeded Sydney.
Everyone in Melbourne right now is clapping and cheering, Lianna.
And that is because Melbourne have experienced higher population growth rate than any other capital city for decades. And that trend is only ever going to continue. So with that in mind, does it make sense that the price gap between Melbourne and Sydney is between $400,000 and $500,000. If you imagine $400,000 and $500,000, about 40 to 50% gap. That does not make sense.
Lianna, you look back in time, Melbourne always follows Sydney, but you can see here that Melbourne has had its downswing, Sydney's had its upswing. Melbourne is currently still at the bottom of its downswing, and is yet to have its upswing to come back up and rematch with Sydney. But that upswing has to come, right?
Yeah, the gap is widening. Over the long term, the gap should really only be a very small one, like 10, 15% gap. But where the gap is now, there's over 30, 40% gap. So that represents value. If we can do the same comparison with other capital cities as well. So where Melbourne should really not be sitting behind Sydney, but very closely behind Sydney.
Yeah. So for those that are familiar with charts and really good with numbers, a 29-year average is a 78% gap. We're currently at 68. So that line needs to redraw up here. And when that occurs, that's when you're going to make your gains in Melbourne. So Oxford Economics is saying 1.2 million for Melbourne, but really the value should be around 1.5 to 1.6 million.
Yeah, because they're also predicting Sydney is going to grow. This is assuming that Sydney doesn't grow or none of the other capital cities grow for the next 3 years, which is not true. Every capital city is going to experience growth. So if they all grow, Melbourne will grow too. But on top of that, Melbourne has got a value gap that it has to catch up on. So we have lots of opportunities in Melbourne. So that doesn't mean that you can just go anywhere in Melbourne and buy a property and make...
There's some oversupply, pockets of oversupply.
Exactly. So we have identified quite a number of opportunities across Melbourne, whether it be, depending on the area, apartments, townhouses, or houses.
Lianna, right? I got that one-bedroom apartment we were talking about. I've just got another couple of houses there as well, a townhouse there as well. I'm looking at the moment. So
remember, if you buy strategically in the right locations, apartments are going to outperform houses in the next few years.
For more videos like this, please click like and subscribe for more information around the property market. Thank you.